Welcome. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion on innovation in cancer care. Those who attend our partner meeting will know that we always provide updates on research and treatment. So this year we thought it might also be interesting to look at opportunities in innovative approaches to cancer care driven by digital, technological, and artificial intelligence. I'm joined by three experts that I know all will bring great insight and experience to this conversation. So firstly, welcome Mike Ambrogi. Mike is currently Senior Technology Fellow at Novocure, an oncology company pioneering a novel therapy approach to solid tumors called Tumor Treating Fields. Mike is joining us today in his capacity as someone with a long career in development and bringing to the market novel solutions in healthcare, including involvement with the development of the iBot wheelchair and also the Segway scooter. Mike is joined by Kathrin Felkendt, femtech expert and innovator herself in women's health. For those of you who haven't come across the femtech sector, it has really expanded in recent years and has grown to encompass a range of technology-enabled women-centric products and solutions. Kathrin is also founder of Femtech Insider, the leading portal for women's health, and co-founder of Perla, HealthWitch, which is a platform for those living with polycystic ovary syndrome. And finally, Chris Yao. Chris is professor of artificial intelligence based at the Big Data Institute at Oxford University in the UK. And Chris also works across the Nuffield Department of Women's and Reproductive Health and Department of Public Health. Mike, I'm going to start with you. One of the things that really stood out for me in your career is that you have been involved in, and I think passionate about, innovation that's driven by cutting-edge technology, but shaped to respond to patient needs and experience. This in itself feels pretty novel. So maybe a few words about why that is important to you and what that looks like in practice.
Sure. Yeah. And innovation isn't really innovation until it's actually helping somebody in the market. There's a difference between innovation and invention. Invention or discovery is one thing, but innovation is when it's actually brought to use where somebody can actually benefit from it. Innovation is a deliberate process. It's not just an event. So it takes a lot of work and a whole ecosystem, which I'm sure we can get into and talk about. I think having a patient focus is super important. It's kind of what they call design level thinking, where you're putting yourself in the shoes of the patient. How are they looking at this new technology? How are they accepting it? And those things are very important. There's a lot of good technology out there that never really impacts people because it hasn't been thought through from a user perspective.
Yeah, very interesting. And just kind of picking up on your point, when it comes to these sort of innovations and these types of solutions, do they face kind of specific or different barriers that exist that might prevent or just discourage them from moving from that innovation stage to being adopted in clinical practice? Is it a harder road to plow than kind of more?
Yeah, and especially in life science, the invention, just the actual invention or discovery is just one piece of it, but you need to have funding sources that are supporting innovation or encouraging innovation. These are funding sources with long timelines, not traditional venture capital. There has to be people willing to take the risk in the clinical trials, right? These trials are hard to execute, and if you have a really truly innovative approach, often you won't find the support you need from the clinical sites to try this and take a risk. People don't want to fail, right? And so you can't be afraid to fail. And then the third piece, I think, is the regulatory has to be able to support it, right? That's a whole nother piece of it that is, there's been some progress made there, particularly in the US, but that still has a ways to go.
Yeah, interesting. So, Kathrin, if I could ask you your perspective. So firstly, how much of your passion for improving the experience of women's health, and in particular gynecological health, is driven by your own personal experience with polycystic ovary syndrome?
So my original background before I got into the women's health space is actually in tech. And sort of as you mentioned, I struggle with polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS. I had been struggling with the symptoms pretty much my entire adult life. And so as to a little bit of my background, I'm actually Austrian. So I've had access to one of the arguably best healthcare systems in the entire world. Yet, when I brought up a lot of the symptoms that I was experiencing as a woman with PCOS, I was sent away and I was told, well, those things are cosmetic. So it was, acne, it was hair loss, it was, hair in places where you don't necessarily like to have hair. But obviously, there's other implications like potential risk for diabetes, higher risk for ovarian cancer, metabolic syndrome, higher risk for cardiac disease. And, when I was first diagnosed, it happened quite late in life for me. And I also didn't have a great care experience, where I was essentially misinformed by my gynecologist at the time with regards to my own fertility. So PCOS is actually the leading cause for infertility for women of reproductive age. And also women with, so PCOS affects around 1 in 10 women globally, and only 50% of women are actually diagnosed. And so, I really got into this as a patient with a tech background. And I was like, well, there must be something better out there that, can help me and like millions of other women who are struggling with the same thing have a better experience. And so, I kind of stumbled upon the femtech space quite early on, a few years ago, and sort of was quite fascinated by, the intersection of women's health and technology. And I couldn't agree more with what Mike said earlier, just innovation for innovation's sake isn't quite meaningful. It really, needs to reach the women that need it. It needs to reach patients. I was just really shocked that there wasn't an industry portal that spoke about women's health innovation in one place. And so kind of started Femtech Insider really at the time as a newsletter and as a side project. And over the past years, we've grown into the leading source for all information about the space, be it digital health, be it medical devices, be it biotech. And so again, I'm, as you said, incredibly passionate about this space.
That's excellent. And just, can you tell us a little bit by way of some of the innovation that's happening in the femtech sector about what some of these developments might look like, and if there are, specific to ovarian cancer, it'd be great to hear about that.
Yeah, I think like the trend that we're seeing now with femtech is, women are increasingly speaking out, and, they want to take charge of their own health. And so we're seeing a lot more innovation also in the cancer space that's actually patient driven, and that's kind of, the patients can use themselves to like kind of, participate in their care journeys and also or diagnostic journeys, whatever it may be, and really, kind of take ownership and play an active role in their own treatment. And so, that can be incredibly empowering. So, the way you can envision that, and we're seeing that specifically in the cancer space with companion apps that can be used to, track your treatments, track your appointments, track your medication, track how you're feeling, and really, kind of help and potentially, also give you access to evidence-based information that you may see, maybe, kind of on short notice, being able to be connected to like a care navigator or a provider that can help you, with a question that maybe just comes up when you're not in the hospital and not, sort of in, professional care, so to say, in any given moment. So I think there's just like kind of technology really has the ability to fill in the gaps between like sort of visits. And I think that can be incredibly powerful. What we're also seeing is a little bit of sort of, on the diagnostic side. So, can we create different risk profiles? A patient that's using an app fills in all their information, and then, sort of this different risk profiles are created based on medical history, maybe based on tests. And, we can just really make sure that women get treatment as early as possible for various different cancers.
Excellent. So Chris, I'm gonna come to you. We're going to talk a little bit about big data, and that's kind of, artificial intelligence has had some really interesting, I think, impactful applications in cancer care. And I'd love for you just to talk a little bit about that, but maybe just a broad overview of artificial intelligence and its impact in healthcare and cancer care, and where it's, seen to be the most useful.
Yeah, I think artificial intelligence is becoming a kind of popular kind of approach for really dealing with a more information-rich world that we live in. We have all sorts of, I call them sensors, whether they're the devices we wear on our wrists, whether they're actual more formal medical devices that might be building. And trying to make best use of that information is typically kind of beyond manual kind of human curation. So we need algorithms to do that, and potentially adaptable algorithms. That's where the kind of artificial intelligence kind of comes in. How does an algorithm adapt itself to the different types of modalities of information that we're seeing? And we're seeing, the use of AI being used for in the diagnostic world, whether it's to process images, different imaging modalities, or different types of diagnostic tests like genomic sequencing, where there's so much information that it's impossible to kind of manually curate it. So we need this kind of computational approach to crunch through all that data to help us to either develop risk profiles or to identify, potentially in rare cases, the root cause of a condition that we have. But I think what's kind of really exciting about AI in a healthcare setting and also in a cancer setting is the potential for AI at the moment to actually help us to design better therapeutics as well. And we're seeing, AI being used to design different chemical or protein structures, which could be underline the basis of new medicines. We're seeing AI being used to identify molecular sequences that have certain properties. That means that when we insert them into individuals, they activate in certain environments or have structural properties that make them more stable, and then make sure that whatever they're delivering are able to survive the environment of the human body. But perhaps kind of in the long term, something that Mike said was looking at process. And I think that some of the big gains in AI are probably going to come when we move beyond looking at AI as simply a tool for achieving simple tasks, but actually thinking of it as a device for handling information flows across the entire process, all the way potentially from pre-diagnosis and the early detection kind of regime, right through to diagnosis, and then how we manage patients after we've diagnosed them and they're in treatment. Potentially also looking even further, what happens after treatment has been administered and perhaps it's successful. What happens if the patient comes back years later with relapse of condition, and how their personal kind of journey, as Kathrin has mentioned, has evolved.
Excellent. And just kind of going back to that's really interesting, but going back now to the patient experience, can you tell us a little bit about that? I think one of your interests is the developing a process or a system that's, I think, described as a little bit of akin to a one-stop travel shop that can generate lots of options and potential outcomes. So I'd be really interested to hear about that and the reaction from the patient group that you've worked with.
Yeah, so I think the traditional kind of model for sort of doctor-patient interaction in a cancer setting is that the patient is often the recipient of information. With the advent of AI, that paradigm could change, because now it may be possible for you to have a device that interprets some of that information for you and it presents it in a form that you can understand and therefore make personal decisions from. And we see this in different walks of life all the time, right? Whether, we turn on our televisions and we have recommendations kind of thrown on us. We take out our phones and there's an app that, suggests we should play a certain music or go to the cinema and watch a certain type of film. It seems plausible and it can be done in a healthcare setting as well. But the really kind of interesting question is that, as we talked about earlier when we talked about innovation, there are lots of possibilities in terms of innovation. In the AI space, we're mathematicians, computer scientists. There's a lot that we can do on the computer that perhaps we can't do, with actual hardware. We can do it really, really quickly as well. And we can innovate, really, really fast and come up with all sorts of ideas that may not only push the boundaries, but, potentially go beyond them. And the patient interaction is really important here to allow us to kind of say to ourselves, okay, we can do all these things, but what should we do? And as Mike sort of alluded to, what is actually useful for us to do in the real world context? And for example, we can build lots of predictive algorithms for cancer, for example, to inform individuals, clinicians, and patients as to how effective a treatment might be for their own cancer. But what happens if that predictive algorithm gives you a result that, given the current state of medical practice, we can't do anything about? Is that piece of information useful to most people? And it will differ for different people. Some people may still want to know anyway, but also many people won't want to know. And from an innovation perspective, we can build these algorithms, but we need to test it out in the real world with real individuals to see how useful that capability is.
Yeah, it was so interesting to hear what Christopher was saying and then what Kathrin was saying. innovation, the AI is one piece, but then it's how you deploy it and how the patients get access to it through some of the things like Kathrin is doing. I think a lot of times innovation happens when you get out of the silo and you're connecting the dots from other areas. So I think it's the broader you can draw the boundary around your thinking, the more likely you are to innovate. And I think that's kind of what's happening here. You got the AI, the patient access, the patient issue. I think caregiver is another piece to factor into that. You got all those pieces together. That's where innovation can happen. But I think that part of the challenge is, I think, you got to get out of the incremental mindset. And so you got to say, you got to think big if you really want to push the ball forward. And that's hard because a lot of the funding sources and other places, they want to see, improvement over 12 months, 18 months. They want to see some results. I think one of the biggest things we could do is develop more innovative funding sources. And I think that's where government plays a role. Certainly in the US, NIH plays a role. Like, how do they evaluate their proposals that they're going to fund? Do they look for incremental, or do they look for really big ideas? I think that's important. Some institutions, like I know at MIT in Boston, they have a tough tech, funding source that looks at long-term bets, right? I think those things are important. So that's what has to happen. But I love the idea of getting people from different areas together, whether it's the patient, caregiver, AI, technology, and that's where I think things can happen. So think big and broad.
I have one final question for you all, and it's about innovation and the opportunity to tackle health inequities, including access to treatment, but also in terms of empowerment of women, especially those who may be living in lower resource settings. How do we ensure that innovations in cancer care actually level out some of these health equity challenges? Kathrin, we'll start with you.
Sure. I genuinely, with all my heart, believe in the great opportunities and the great change that technology and generally innovation can bring about. And specifically when it comes to healthcare, I think we really have an opportunity here to give more patients access to gold standard care, who potentially may not be able to access a KOL or an expert treatment facility close to them. So I think there's a great opportunity there. But while saying that, I think, as people building in this space, and, I will include myself here, we need to be very aware of our own biases and, be very careful with regards to, what are social determinants of health equity, who actually has access to a lot of these new things that we're all building. And, it goes back to the point that was made earlier. Innovation just for innovation's sake, is actually meaningless if it doesn't reach the people that need it the most.
Yeah, I think obviously, as Kathrin mentioned, a lot of great things are happening and putting power in the hands of the patient and the caregivers. I think that's going to help a lot, but I think it does boil down to these reimbursement sources. I mean, healthcare, there are a lot of things going on in the digital domain that are helping to reduce the cost, and virtual visits and things like that are going to help. But at the end of the day, that healthcare has to get paid for. And I think that having the reimbursement authorities really understand this democratization and equalization of care is important. And I think that, covering innovative therapies right from the start, giving patients a chance to have access to it while the data is getting collected, I think is important. And we need to move that ahead a little faster.
But I'm like Kathrin, I'm a technology optimist, and I think AI could be really useful in another area in terms of addressing equity. And as I said, at the beginning, is that we're living in a more information-rich world, and some of those information sources are becoming even more complex, to the point where your doctors, your clinical teams may not themselves have the ability to interpret those signals. And the quality of their interpretation may not be uniform. There'll be a difference between someone who's based at the top, research hospital, in the most well-funded environment in like the US or something, versus someone working in a community setting, in a rural area who doesn't have all these facilities, but they're potentially receiving the same type of information. And your experience as a patient may vary depending on their interpretation, but that may change with AI assistance. So I really think sort of AI potentially has, there are concerns about exacerbating existing biases, but there's a potential for well-designed AI to really be a part of the solution to addressing inequities.
That's really interesting. So I want to thank all of you so much for joining us today. It's been a really, really interesting conversation, and I think one that I hope we can carry on beyond this partner meeting and this session, but just to say thank you, Kathrin, thank you, Mike, thank you, Chris. It's been a delight to speak to you today.